The only type of parrot apparently known by the ancient Greek and Roman authors and artists was actually a parakeet, Psittacula, namely an Indian parakeet. The gray African parrot is never mentioned nor depicted, and no evidence is to be found about our other varieties, except perhaps for the hill mynah. But in India today, there are 15 species of parrots, but only 3 of them, all parakeets, are widespread and common over the whole subcontinent. Here you can see the ring-necked Psittacula crameri, which is one, all green with a red bill. And then there is the so-called Alexandrine Psittacula eupatria, which is bigger, larger than the ring-necked, and has a maroon shoulder patch, which identifies the species. And then a third variety, which is called a plum-headed or Psittacula cyanocephala, which is characterized, as you can see, by this reddish, colorful head. According to Elian, parakeets were fed in the parks of Indian princes, and they would freely fly and spontaneously crowd around the king. Elian adds that psittacoi were not eaten in India because the Brahmins considered them sacred as a consequence of their ability to speak. The Greco-Roman name of the animal was probably derived from its Indian denomination Psittake, according to Pliny, which was spelled, variously spelled in Greek and Latin, as you can see. Psittacus, Psittacus, Psittacos, Psittacos, Psittake, Psittake, Sittas, and so on. No mention of the animal are to be found in classical times. The most ancient one we read in a fragment from Ctesias Indica, preserved by Photius. The fragment is somehow puzzling because the colors do not match any variety of parakeet, actually. Bigwood has proposed an addition that you can see in the English translation to make the description fit with the plum-headed parakeet. Ctesias lived for a long time at the Persian court, as we know. And much of the information he gathered about India is based on reports of Persian visitors or Indian merchants and envoys to the Persian court. But he might have seen a parakeet himself if it is true that he heard it speaking some Greek words picked up from Ctesias himself, maybe. Parakeets were probably sent as valuable gifts to the Persian court by their Indian vassals and diplomats and kept in the royal menageries. However, parrots are to be found in Persian art, but very rarely. All we have, according to Louis Jones, is a gold pendant around the 4th century BC, a couple of seals, and 2 handles, fragmentary handles. This is all we have. So whether Ctesias had seen it himself or was reporting someone else's description remains undecided. The second mention of the animal in the Greek literature is in a fragment from a comedy by Aeolus after 380 BC, where it appears among other birds purchased as delicacies for a feast. But it is probably just a comic joke. The diffusion of the parakeet in the Mediterranean does not seem to have occurred before the late Hellenistic times. In the ancient Egyptian culture, we have no evidence of the parakeet. The Egyptian culture seems to ignore the existence of the animal. And to the best of my knowledge, no parrots are to be found in Jewish authors. It is common view that it was Alexander the Great who made the bird popular in Greece following the expedition to India. According to Rice, the first parrots were brought to the Greek world by Nearchos in the wake of Alexander's Indian campaign. According to Arian of Nicomedia, the captain of Alexander, who explored India actually, reported on Indian Psittacus as astonishing wonders. However, Rice's opinion about the role played by Nearchos in introducing the species into Greece is contradicted by the very fact that we have no evidence of parakeets, neither in literature nor in art, for the late 4th century. So Rice's opinion is probably a modern example of the ancient obsession with the proto-Saurotes. Even for the 3rd century BC, only one mention appears that I will consider in a few minutes in an indirect report of the Grand Parade organized in Alexandria by Ptolemy II. As regards iconography, the most ancient depiction of a Psittacus in Greek art comes from Pergamon and dates back to the mid-2nd century BC, and it is a reconstruction made in the 50s of the last century at the Pergamon Museum in Berlin, actually. And it is quite an isolated representation, as in order to find other depictions of parakeet, we need to look at the Roman art of the late 1st century BC. All considered, it is my opinion that the parakeet, albeit known by the Greeks since the first half of the 4th century BC, have not been popularized in the early Hellenistic culture yet. As a matter of fact, Aristotle cannot say much about the animal. He touches upon it only one time in his Historia Animalium, in the passage I am showing on this slide. As you can see, the mention is very brief. Apparently, the animal was still a rarity and basically renowned for its ability to reproduce the human voice, anthropoglotton. Aristotle's last remark, however, seems to show that somewhere in India or Persia or in Greece itself, the animal was already kept for entertainment, possibly at dinner, as it will be centuries later in Rome. The circumstance is not impossible to imagine, as many birds in the wild are consumers of ethanol, a natural byproduct of the fermentation process of fruit sugars, and pet birds are no exception. In a recent survey of the phenomenon of birds sharing alcoholic drinks with their human owners, an international research team based in Poland has suggested that the high representation of drinking parrots on social media is not only because they are common pets and thus recorded on amateur movies, but also because they have a very strong metabolism response to potential poisons, including alcohols and phenols, and their response to alcohol is particularly spectacular and fun. As for the 3rd century BC, the only mention of a Psittacus has been recorded by Athenaeus. According to him, Calixenus of Rhodes, in the late 3rd century BC, in his work on Alexandria, described Ptolemy II grand procession through the city of Alexandria, which had taken place some decades earlier, around 275 or 270 BC. According to Athenaeus, the parade featured among thousands of other precious items, also 150 men holding branches of trees loaded with any kind of wild animal and birds, and cages with parakeets, peacocks, guinea fowls, pheasants, and other Ethiopian birds, all in great amount. Undoubtedly, in Calixenus' account, parrots are presented as exotic birds. They show up in cages among other Ethiopian birds, together with peacocks that are definitely from India, like parrots, but had been imported much earlier by the Greeks from the beginning of the 5th century BC, and then by the Romans already in the 2nd century BC. Then there are Guinea fowls, Numida meleagris, which is actually an African species, and one subspecies in particular, the Numida meleagris, is from Ethiopia. Pheasants' best known homeland was instead Colloque on the Black Sea. Accumulation of mingled items in vast quantity was a typical marker of luxury in ancient times, and we should not attribute much significance to the sequence of items in this description. However, the same idea of Ethiopian parakeets lurks behind the fictional episode of the encounter between Alexander the Great and the Queen of Meroe in the Alexander romance. According to this narrative, Alexander would have wanted to attack the Ethiopian kingdom of Meroe, which was ruled by the Queen Kandake. The two characters exchange letters. In her response to Alexander's proposal to meet her in Meroe, Kandake resists the Macedonian attempt and, trying to impress him by showing off her kingdom's wealth, announces that she would send him ambassadors with precious gifts, among which 200 parakeets. Again, the parakeets are deemed Ethiopian animals together with sphinxes, that is the sphinx ape species commonly thought to be African. They both are mentioned after an amount of gold and 500 young Ethiopian slaves, separately from the list of wild animals and wild animal products that follows, leaving the impression that they were and were meant to be tame animals. Scholars have suspected that the list of Kandake's gift has been inspired by the list of animals and items on display in Ptolemy's Grand Parade. In his commentary to the text, Krzysztof Nowodka gives no credit to the account in the romance, condemning the entire episode as historically unreliable. According to him, Kandake's land in the romance appears as a conflation of African and Indian elements, in line with those classical authors who tacitly assumed that all dark-skinned people, Etíopes, lived in Africa, including Indian people. It's a matter of fact, indeed, that Ethiopia and India were often confused in ancient sources, and it might be true that in the passage about the Grand Procession, as well as here, Indian and Ethiopian birds all stand in general for Eastern species. As Parker points out, in the ancient world, the link between an exotic commodity and its place of origin was part of the item value, but this link often remained vague because the final consumer would often confuse places such as China, India, or the Red Sea under a common umbrella of the Far East. In the case of the parakeet in particular, the confusion about their place of origin rested probably on the geographical unit called Erythraean Sea, which included the Red Sea, the Persian Gulf, and the western part of the Indian Ocean. In fact, maritime traffic between Egypt and India started increasing precisely under the Ptolemaic dynasty. Ptolemy II himself founded the city of Berenike, named after his mother, on the coast of the Red Sea, and the city became in the next century one of the most important ports for imported Indian goods via the Erythraean Sea. With the establishment of a trade network between Egypt, Ethiopia, and India, and the progressive intensification of the traffic on the maritime route, the Mare Erythraeum emerged as a geographical entity with the coastal cities facing it intermingled into an area perceived as unified. As a consequence, many goods exchanged on that trade route could be alternatively labeled as Indian, Ethiopian, or Arab. For all their literary nature and disregard of historical accuracy, I am not sure we should simply discard the two passages from Calixenus and Pseudo-Callisthenes as totally void of historical interest. Alexander never traveled to Ethiopia and probably never attacked Meroe, but his successors' interference with Ethiopian politics is well attested. Ptolemy II himself, in fact, tried to submit the kingdom of Meroe during his reign. Ethiopian animals and commodities mentioned in the Grand Parade may actually reflect Ptolemy's claim of power over that part of the world, perceived as the very southern fringes of the Egyptian kingdom, and worth being conquered, if anything else, to obtain war elephants. Moreover, the relation between Ethiopia and parrots recurs elsewhere in our sources. According to Pliny, Nero's Praetorians sent to explore the Ethiopian cities sailed up the Nile, taking note of the distances between the towns they encountered, thus solving long-standing disputes among contemporary geographers about the real distance between Syene and Meroe. Just past the island of Gaugade, halfway between Syene and Meroe, they started seeing the first parrots. Pliny clearly mentioned the Psittacus as resident native birds, as well as the sphinx ape and the baboon mentioned next. It is worth noticing that Pliny does not show any surprise at Nero's explorers' findings. On the contrary, the phrase "in de primum visas aves Psittacus et sphingion et cynocephalos," etc., conveys the idea that all three species were expected to show up somewhere around there, and they did, in fact. Pierre Schneider includes the passage in his list of instances attesting to the intermingling of India and Ethiopia, a direct consequence, as already mentioned, of the conceptualization of the Erythraean Sea as a geographical unit. However, Pliny's statement is most likely to be based on the report written by Nero's explorers a few years earlier. Please note in the text the insistence on the adverb nuper. So this is the only evidence we possess about possible Ethiopian Psittacus recorded by a contemporary eyewitness. I do not think we should so easily dismiss it as a case of confusion. Schneider would probably object that the perception of a unified Erythraean Sea area would have induced the explorers to see in Ethiopia what they would have expected to observe in India. They may have experienced, so to speak, a cognitive error, a wrong identification of an unknown type with a better known species, mistaking a mysterious African bird, maybe similar to the parakeet, for the Psittacus they were ready to catch sight of in an area that was thought of a sort of an Ethiopian India or an Indian Ethiopia. However, Arnott reminds us that currently the wild parakeet's range reaches beyond India into a strip of Africa, extending from Gambia and Senegal across to central and southern Sudan and northern Ethiopia, and puts trust in Pliny's report that a wild African population already existed in his times. Tamed parakeets that have escaped or been released may also have produced feral populations a long way from their place of origins, as it happened in recent times in the Nile Valley in Egypt, as in many places in Europe. If so, how and when was that population of Indian parakeets introduced into Ethiopia? The fact may have occurred as earlier as the 3rd or 2nd century BC under Ptolemaic rulers, thanks to Indian or Arab merchants. According to the author of the Periplus Mariae Erythraeae, deemed to have been written in the 1st century AD, the trade between India and Egypt had already a long history at his time. Despite neither Greco-Roman nor Indian ships had dared to sail further than Arabia Felix, their cargoes would drop their loads in Arabia, where goods were exchanged. Parakeets may have been already part of the traded items. Alternatively, the feral wild population observed by Nero's explorers would have settled there recently after a regular maritime route between the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean was sailed by Western merchants in the late 1st century BC. That's at the very end of the 1st millennium BC. If any of these hypotheses hold true, one could imagine for a parakeet a scenario not different from that described by Parker for the elephant trade, and I'm quoting Parker here. Whereas the ancient world most distinguished commander, it asked Alexander the Great, was associated with the Indian elephant and the Indian parakeet, those known firsthand in the Roman world were much more likely to have come from Africa. Unfortunately, no relics, as far as I know, no relics of parakeet skeletons have been found by archaeologists in Meroe nor in other Nubian sites excavated. Therefore, no conclusion can be drawn, and I'm afraid the parakeet is one of those invisible species for archaeogeologists, difficult to detect, but you will tell me later about this. What seems to be certain is the fact that the diffusion of the parakeet in the Mediterranean area occurred later than Alexander's campaign to India, and that Ethiopia and Egypt played a major role in it. That is, it didn't spread via Bactria in Mesopotamia on the land route, but probably via Ethiopia on the maritime route. The popularity of the Psittacus as a pet animal began in the wake of the Roman conquest of Egypt and reached its peak in imperial times. After Action, the Romans took over the maritime cities of the Red Sea coast, along with their network of trade contacts. In a famous anecdote, Augustus, precisely on his way back to Rome after his victory over Antony and Cleopatra, ran into a raven who greeted him with the word, "Hail Caesar, the victorious commander." Flattered, he bought the bird for 20,000 sesterces. The news was quickly spread, and other people instructed their birds to greet the imperator and offered them to him. According to Macrobius, who recorded the episode, Augustus purchased 2 corvi, 1 pica, and 1 Psittacus. An epigram by Crinagoras, by Crinagoras of Mytilene, probably written in Rome and probably around the same years, mentions a Psittacus who escaped from its cage, flies to the woods, and teaches other wild birds to utter Haire in honor of Caesar, and most likely Octavianus. Having talking birds greeting the emperor became a custom in imperial Rome and a narrative topos. Interestingly, during a recent restoration of the Domus Augusti on the Palatine Hill, the archaeologists found a fragment of fresco depicting a parakeet. Only one generation earlier, the parakeet were still a paradoxon in Rome, worth being shown in public ceremonies together with albino blackbirds and other unusual things of that sort, as attested by Varro. To Ovid, it is still a rare animal. In imperial times, the popularity of the parakeet increased rapidly at the expenses of the native talking birds, such as the jay, pica, various corvids, corvus, cornix, and the starling, sturnus. As it is implicit in the anecdote about Augustus mentioned above, they were much more common talking birds than parrots. The rivalry established by the Romans between the native talking birds and the Indian exotic Psittacus is evident in Pliny's description. After praising the Psittacus' ability to utter not only human words, but even sentences, quidem etiam sermocinantes, He declares that the J's loquacitas, maybe pronunciation, is more distinct and articulated expressio than the parakeets. Then he goes on listing the other native birds endowed with the ability to memorize and reproduce human words, among which you have, of course, the jay, the starling, the crow, and the raven. The main reason of the parakeet's success, Pliny holds in the passage, lies more in its Indian origins than in its ability to speak. In this, the Indian bird is not better than the picae, whose minor nobilitas is rather due to the mere fact that they do not come from abroad, quia non ex longinquo venit. No doubt, it was its rarity and exoticism that made the Psittacus particularly precious. Its provenance is regularly marked in literary text. The bird was expensive and probably became a sign of wealth for people like Ovid's beloved Corinna and Statius' friend Macer. Both Ovid's and Statius' poems, composed to celebrate the death of their friend's beloved Psittacus, emphasize the fact that the Psittacus comes from the easternmost land on earth. Precious as they were, Psittacus was preferably kept in metal cages to prevent them from breaking out. Macer's Psittacus cage in particular was worthy of such a costly bird. Statius calls it a happy prison, beatus carcer, and describes it as made of ivory and silver, topped with a ruddy dome. Nonetheless, the Romans preferred the Psittacus over the native talking birds also for the brightness of its colorful plumage. Ovid speaks of its rariforma coloris and describes the two different types of red, jasper red and Punic red, on its wings and beak. Almost 2 centuries later, Apuleius will praise the beauty of the red color around its neck, bright as a golden necklace. With the exception of ravens and crows, the other talking birds aspect is not unpleasant, but a quick overview will give you an idea of the difference between them and the parakeet. Here is a raven and a crow, a jay and a magpie.
Cristiana, avresti 5 minuti ancora, ce la fai?
Sì, ho quasi finito.
Perfetto.
So most likely, therefore, the parakeet's success over the native talking birds was ensured by a combination of beauty and exoticism. Again, Pliny let us know the Romans' point of view on this matter. After affirming that the picae have a much better pronunciation than parrots, he claims that their gift of speech compensates them for their lack of beauty. In the 2nd century AD, the bird was so spread and well known that, according to Arrian, there was no need to describe the animal to a Greco-Roman audience any longer. The Psittacus' marvelous aspect is in fact had inspired not only poets, but also painters and mosaicists. According to Antero Tammisto, parakeets appear on Roman mosaics much more often than any native Italian bird. And here you can see some beautiful examples. Not without a touch of his notorious flattery, Statius even claimed that the parakeet's aspect is superior to that of the most beautiful exotic birds, like peacocks, pheasants, and guinea fowls. To conclude, if the parakeet was most likely imported into the Mediterranean area via Ethiopia and Egypt in the 3rd or 2nd century BC, it is only in Roman times that the colorful Indian bird started spreading as a pet bird of choice, thanks to its talent for mimicry, its playful nature, and its beauty. It quickly became a status symbol for wealthier Romans, and in time, it replaced native species as the talking bird par excellence in Western imagination. Thank you.